It's been a hot minute since we've sat down for a jam session with everyone's favorite biotech finance guru, Allan Shaw, but that changes today. I'm Matt Pillar. This is the Business of Biotech. And on today's show, Allan and I are going to be talking about biotech leadership, planning, and strategy. And while there's never a bad time to be plotting out your next C-suite talent moves, it's a particularly timely talk right now as stubborn scrutiny and volatility continue to harshly persecute biotech management missteps that would have likely been handily forgiven just a few years ago. Executive teams in biotech are a study in evolution. They come together over time and with intention. Getting caught without the right people in the right seats at the right times can be costly, but so can putting those people in those seats. On today's episode, I'll interrogate Allan's wisdom gained over a decades-long career in which he's been both a strategic hirer and a strategic hire. Allan, it's good to see you.
Great to see you, Matt. Hope things are all well, and always a pleasure to get together for one of these sessions.
It sure is. Yeah, this one's overdue. We need to get our cadence back, back into a more regular fashion, I think.
I'm happy to do so. And as we head into the fall, this is a great time to do it.
Sure is. Yeah. So I want to start out with, the danger zone, right? I want to start out with a discussion around the dangers in poorly metered hiring moves. And I asked this like with the backdrop of some context. I've been reading on the airwaves, some of the forums out there, the reflection on some of the companies that have fallen on hard times of late and let a lot of people go. And I often see finger pointing around executive hiring strategy. I don't know how much of that is bluster, how much of it's true, but what from your perspective, what are some of the dangers that lurk in poorly metered hiring decisions?
Certainly given where we are as an industry, it's certainly always a good time to kind of reflect and take stock on what works, what doesn't work. And I guess it's also important to eternalize that one size doesn't fit all, but these are general guidelines and practices. I think generally speaking, you do want to be early than late when you bring resources on board. But, you have to be thoughtful about it, too. If you bring in an elephant and there's only a few mice, the elephant isn't going to stick around. It's not going to be interesting enough. So, it depends on where the organization is and how the organization evolves. I think going back to, your specific question, I'd call out a couple of areas to talk about and focus on. One is certainly, I think there's some inevitably blind spots in decision making. And I think a lot of decisions many times are fear driven as well, based on insecurity or the perception that they should be doing something. One major risk is that people often know what they know, but they don't always recognize what they don't know. And these are important blind spots. And, I think be able to expand around that and get input from others, help, talking to the board, talking to your organization, thinking about what you really need is important, and understanding the implications to your culture as you do it as well. I think there's also fear-driven decisions. In the absence of good information, fear and insecurity can drive poor decisions. This often manifests in hiring decisions based on perceived expectations rather than the actual needs. And I think as people think about, for example, that they have aspirations for it to be public at some point in time, they have certain concerns about where they are relative to where they should be from an organizational perspective. So those are some of the things to be mindful of as you think about it, and often can lead to bad decisions.
Yeah. Where does that, just to follow up to that one, where do you see that pressure coming from? Like in fear-driven decisions, you talked about perceived expectations rather than actual needs. Is that sort of is it a shareholder, a perceived shareholder pressure, board level pressure, investor level? Like where's that pressure coming from?
I think it's probably the endpoint is what's driving that, right? If you're looking to be a public company, and you're looking to be a public company, over the next year. And that's somewhat bold given the fact that it's been very hard to go public. But from my perspective, I think that's a really realistic expectation with interest rates starting to come down now, with the election behind us in short time. I think it's going to be much more fertile, and I think there are a lot of organizations that have done crossovers and are ready to go that are just sitting on the runway. So I think as that starts to open up, I think IPO aspirations are very real. And I think there's then a level of expectation that when the company is ready to go, when the window is open, that you're ready to go, right? And that leads to, starting your car and letting the engine run for a while. So, you need to gauge a little bit of what, the pathway that you need to go. Usually you do a crossover round and there's steps along the way. And as you move along the way, you need to, I guess there's an investor expectation that you have your house in order and that you can do things. And again, given the emphasis on determining whether or not you even have a business, right? You need to kind of get answers scientifically. I think it gets people into a position, well, when do we start building the rest of the organization?
Yeah.
And I think that's where some of those, and where the anxiety comes from. And it's good anxiety because directionally they're correct. But, there's a lot of steps in the way in terms of how you stage your organizational build out. And I don't know if it necessarily has to be the immaculate conception.
Yeah. Yeah. When I asked that first question, I was sort of dancing around, this idea that when companies fall on financial hard times, a lot of finger pointing starts happening around the executive leadership team. And an example that strikes me like right now. I mean, this episode will drop a few weeks from now, but like in the moment that we're in right now. A few weeks ago, I had Rahul Kakar on the podcast. He's the CEO at Tome and Tome Biosciences. They, raised a couple $100 million, I think, last spring. They're in a tough spot right now. They made an acquisition. They spent a lot of money on a company recently, but they're in a tough spot financially right now. And there's, they're dealing with those consequences. They just let a whole bunch of people go. They got some bad press. And when you read into the weeds, you start reading the commentary on the forums from industry observers, shareholders, even biotech employees. A lot of finger pointing happens like, whoa, look at all the money they're spending on their executive leadership team, And I go, I don't know. I don't know that that's going to contribute mightily to the downward spiral of a $200+ million funded company. But you tell me, like, I'm curious about that. Do you think that overzealous spending on high dollar, C-level leadership can or does contribute to, the runway running short, and why or why not?
Yeah, it's certainly an interesting question, and certainly I've seen criticism like that attributed elsewhere. And, I think when things aren't going well, right, I think the salaries that compensation that executives of troubled companies receive becomes a little bit of a lightning rod. And I think, and I get that, but I also would call out in this industry where there's a lot of industrial jeopardies and binary risks.
Yeah.
That, it's, a company could be well run and still have issues like that. at the end of the day. But it's certainly easy to be a Monday morning quarterback and criticize people after the fact. If everything was going good, no one would have a problem. And then it becomes a decision of whether or not those people should be retained or not. It's not whether or not they should be getting paid. Everyone should be getting paid. But whether or not those were really the right hiring decisions, whether they were the right fits, there's other questions to be asked as opposed to how much money they're necessarily making, in my view. Leadership versus resource allocation, I'm not sure if it really works that way. I think building out a C-level leadership doesn't automatically lead to running out of money. But it certainly ties into how an organization prioritizes and allocates its resources. Mm-hmm. And you shouldn't be, and I think it talks about fit. It also talks about the kind of person that you want in your organization, right? I think a lot of us are generally working, to make an impact. And the benefits associated with making that impact would result in wealth creation. The salaries pay our bills at the end of the day. It's a punch in the clock. So and what I've often marveled is that when you see companies that are broken companies that are reverse merger candidates, it asks the question, why are these people sticking around? The equity isn't worth anything. And those people are probably cast in the wrong roles because they're very happy just collecting their cash and they're not looking to, move the needle at the end of the day.
Yeah.
I would also call out that, a balanced approach to scaling an organization is also crucial. The key is ensuring that the company's value drivers, like development programs, are adequately funded to reach critical inflection points, while simultaneously bringing in the necessary expertise to inform optimal decision-making and resource deployment. I think before, you build the whole house, you want to make sure that the fundamental plumbing is working and ready to go. And then you can certainly scale accordingly. And I think you need to, when I talk about development programs, it's not just making sure that the programs are fundamental and that you're going to be delivering some good data, but I think you also need to understand, what are you going to need to do organizationally to grow that? What are your inflection points? What are your timing? Because again, if you're looking to go public as well, you need to have all of these things identified because timing is really important. Otherwise, it's also the tail wagging the dog. You do need to understand how to build the organization. And I think the organization follows really the development programs. Also, time is a critical factor. Many factors influence these decisions, but one constant remains: time is the enemy. The time and cost associated with poor decision-making can never be recaptured. Time is lost and you never get that back. So you do need to think about, not being, so focused on today's cost if it's going to have a real impact on tomorrow. I mean, and that's a balanced thought. I'm also often advocate that you don't want to get too much in front of your skis, but you can never lose cost of time. And I can't say enough about it. Yeah. But ultimately, the real question is, how can companies source the expertise that they most need on a practical basis? Because there's no dispute that adult supervision is required. But the shorter answer is one size doesn't fit all. From a resource perspective, it may not be practical or even prudent to fully build out a C-level team. Instead, companies might consider more thoughtful scaling approaches, like utilizing C-suite executives on a fractional basis, while leveraging others to build out functionality along with processes. A good example, it would be, do you need to bring the CFO in day one, or can the CFO help with providing guidance, helping strategically, helping with the selection of a controller who can then actually come in and put in the foundational, purchase to pay processes and safeguard your cash, and also make sure that the underlying accounting is in order and that you have audited financial statements, which are prerequisites for going public. You know, that's just an example.
Yeah.
And and I guess to kind of distill that, you know, if a company can't afford the entire cow, the fractional approach allows them to buy the steak instead, and providing access to really the expertise needed to avoid costly mistakes without overcommitting resources to manage the company's growth and organizational needs responsibly.
I want to, let's jump into that a little bit. This discussion around fractional leadership versus bringing people on full time right out of the gate. And I want to kind of balance this. I wanted to ask you a question around conversations that I've had with biotech leaders who, tell me when they're talking about hiring strategy, and oftentimes this comes along with them mentioning a very specific person, like, the I've got Allan Shaw on my team. Allan Shaw joined my team because he was available. He's a ringer. So I went out there and I hired Allan Shaw. They tell me that they hire these executives when they're available, not necessarily when they're necessitated. So I'm going to ask you a number of questions about this, but and how that sort of aligns with this fractional hiring mentality. Other biotech execs tell me like, hey, I'd really like to have Allan Shaw on my team. I'm going to have Allan Shaw on my team. I don't really think I need Allan Shaw yet, but when I need Allan Shaw, I'm going to go get Allan Shaw. What's the right approach there in your mind? Is it like, hey, this person's available, maybe it's a chief regulatory officer, for instance. We all know that like there comes a pretty distinct point on the clinical path where if you don't have a chief regulatory officer advising you and leading that function, you're probably going to be in big trouble. But maybe it's 2 years before you need that chief regulatory officer, but the one you want is available. Do you go get her or do you wait until you need her?
It's such a real life situation, and it's one that I've been in conversations many times, and really on both sides of the conversation. And again, cash, financial resources is a rate limiting factor in terms of when you bring people on. If you're expecting data, do you wait till after you get the data? What happens, if this doesn't work, we're actually going to have to start laying people off as opposed to bringing people on. So, there's tension throughout all this process. Many times I've seen conversations that, we should talk in 6 months or we should talk in a year. But I certainly respect it. And then you also have to ask yourself, when you bring somebody in and the company isn't ready for that, are they going to be happy? Is there enough there for them right now?
Yeah.
If going into a company full time that just completed their Series A, I don't think necessarily makes a lot of sense for the company. There's just not enough to do. Maybe if you expand somebody's role, you can do it. Yeah, I'm the chief operating officer, the CFO, and chief HR and administrative officer. Okay. My role's expanded, but am I happy? I don't know. So, I think it makes sense depending on the circumstances and how far off you are, because it should be win-win for everybody. The idea of hiring top talent whenever available, regardless of the immediate need, is similar to the strategy of successful sports teams that draft the best athlete available rather than filling a specific position. Well, but I would also say that while it sounds rather idealistic, it's probably much easier said than done.
Yeah.
I would also, carrying on, I think when you think about the prioritization of needs, I believe that, in applying the Maslow hierarchy of needs to drug development, it serves as a guide for determining when hiring top talent is truly necessary versus when it might be an unjustifiable luxury.
Mm-hmm.
And again, bringing in expertise doesn't necessarily mean hiring. There are a lot of different ways to, inform your activities, to execute, to work around issues without necessarily bringing, hiring somebody full time. But, going back to your point, if you're one I see and living with, we're talking about a company that's talking about going into the clinic, right? They're saying, the use of proceeds, we're going in and we're running phase 2, but they don't have a chief medical officer on staff. In my mind, that's probably something that needs to be spoken to, and I think people certainly understand that you may not be able to afford one right now. But I think then speaking about what is that phenotype that you're looking for? What are you looking for to augment the team? So I think those things are important to be aware of as you execute. And then ultimately, we're in the business of drug development. And without data generation, there's no de-risking. And as the saying goes, in God we trust and in data we believe. This underscores the importance of aligning leadership hires with the critical stages of development and data generation.